What do you think about the increasing focus on social history and history from a bottom-up perspective?
I think it's a very important and useful development in history because too often we've looked at the people who left the records, the people who, in other words, were middle class, upper class, and literate. And I think it's important to try and make history as broad as possible and to find out what lives were like for people who, perhaps in a pre-literate age, were working in the fields, they were artisans, women, to find out what their lives were like, because history is poor without us knowing it. But I think we need all sorts of history, so I think an exclusive focus on social history leaves out political history, for example, and leaves out the ways in which politics, in which changes in economics, which changes in industry, for example, the development of new types of communications, whether it's railways or the internet, the ways in which those changes can affect people's lives. And so I see history as something that must take into account how societies worked, felt, thought, fed themselves, clothed themselves, and so on. But we need to know the context within which those things were happening, because the political and economic and societal context, the institutions, also matter.
Why do you think it's so important to examine historical personalities when people want to talk about inevitability in history? For instance, that 1919 led directly to 1939.
Well, I don't like to think that history is inevitable. I think because I don't want to live in a world that I don't feel I have any chance of changing, that everything is preordained. I mean, I think that's not the sort of world I want to live in. Now, I may be wrong. Maybe everything that happens to me is preordained. However, I would like to think that human beings have choices. We've been given, I believe, free will, and somehow we've developed a capacity to think. I mean, this miraculous development of Homo sapiens. And I think we should respect that. And I think you can see at moments in history there are alternatives. There are different paths before societies.
How do you respond to those who may argue that historical accounts shouldn't have decorative aspects or be entertaining?
Well, I don't want to write that sort of history. I mean, if people want to write history that puts you to sleep and is very dry, fine, that's their business. But I don't think many people are going to read it. And I think that's a shame, because I think history belongs to us all. I think history is very important. I think a well-educated citizen should know something of the history of their own country, and indeed should know something of the wider context within which that country functions. And so I think a history that doesn't make people want to read it is really not doing its job. And you say decorative aspects. I see actually writing history in an intelligible way and an interesting way is in fact part of what we should be doing. And it doesn't mean dumbing it down, and it doesn't mean just telling a whole series of stories, but what it does mean, I think, is making people realize that the past was a real place, that real things were happening there, and make them understand why it's important to know that. And I do see history in certain very important ways as a branch of literature.